we're going to do some episodes to do with feminism in the creative industry. And this is the first episode of that series. We have like 3 planned, but it could turn into more. Also, we have a lot of solo episodes coming up, like without guests, just an FYI. Because a lot of the episodes we've been posting up until now have been mostly with guests. And over the holidays, obviously, it's difficult to get people. And then also you're away for almost the whole of January. So we're recording a lot of episodes without guests. This is going to be the first one of the feminism series. And we're going to go into a little bit of the history of feminism in the design industry. So recently I've been getting into radical feminism. And if you don't know what that means, I would suggest doing a Google search or asking ChatGPT, because a lot of people have a weird idea of what radical feminism is. Basically, it's like a different type of feminism that looks at the structural patriarchy that we live in and less identity politics or a lot of the things you will see online about feminism, like, oh, men are the problem and I hate men and whatever, like, let's all be lesbians. Like, that's very like liberal feminism. And recently I've been getting into radical feminism, and I just thought it would be interesting because I'm like looking at these structures of the patriarchy to look at it from the perspective of our industry, because obviously every single industry is affected by the patriarchy. And radical feminists believe that it's important to understand the structures in order to dismantle them. And yeah, I just thought it would be cool to do some episodes on feminism in the creative industry, because we are obviously affected by it as women. And men are also affected by this, by the way. That's also something that's important to note. And we will be doing an episode that also has to do with like pricing and value. And that also affects men in our industry, not just women. So, but in this episode, we're going to focus on the history so we can kind of get into the context of why is feminism even a topic when we're talking about design and design industry.
It's actually a pretty huge topic. Right,
Yeah.
I have some notes prepared because I hope we can like relay a lot of facts here and like from the research that we did. I guess let's just start a little bit with the history of design.
Mm-hmm.
I would go back to before the industrialization, like not go back into, I don't know, like super historic times, but I think the most relevant one is probably before industrialization. And back then, you could say that we all were kind of like just the makers, or the people were like makers. They weren't like designers per se, or people who do like creative direction. Think of it more like everyone just did everything, everyone just executed. And I think that pretty much sums it up, what was happening before the industrialization. One more thing to note is that, of course, women were mostly in textile industries, in garments, and things like that. And men were like designing tools, weapons. They were in architecture and also designing some structural, like in general, more like structural things. I think that sums it up as well. Other than that, let's move right into the industrialization, where kind of like the split happened. So basically, we split into the design thinking and into execution, as in the labor, which is extremely interesting. And that's also when the divide started happening even more between women and men in the industry. One could say that things shifted between authorship versus execution, scalability versus disposable work, mental versus physical labor. And that's kind of like what one could call the root of the imbalance. Of course, it happened way before then, but I think it's a good place to set our marker, and it's a good place to start.
Yeah, I think what should be obvious to everyone is the reason why men and women are not equal in the design industry and in any industry for that matter, is because men have had hundreds of years of a head start, because we weren't even allowed to take part in these industries. We weren't even allowed to work or to learn and all of that. But it's important to find a context for this conversation. And I think that starting where you just suggested is a good one. So this difference between craft and thinking is very important. because historically women were expected to do a lot of these things as part of their domestic duties. So as part of like housework, they were expected to fix textiles or create also for their communities. Women have historically been involved in community leadership and community building. And obviously when you have community, so if you think of a school, there's events and then you need a poster and then you need invites and you need all these things. And women would do that as just part of their domestic tasks as a woman or as a mother. Like those are the things that are just expected of them. I mean, you've probably seen it in like, even today, it's still something that women do disproportionately more than men. If you see like TV shows, there's always like a Halloween episode and then the woman's like making costumes for her children. It's very representative of the kind of tasks that women were expected to do, even like it just historically, that was execution work, creative work that was not compensated. Like on the other hand, you have the men who are doing the more rational work, strategic work, design in terms of like strategy, and became a commercial and high value task performed by men. So then you have like this creative craft side, which was feminized, and then the design strategic thinking side, which became more masculinized.
Okay, so to add on top of that, you also have to think that if you like kind of zoom out, you see it like even in today's, especially also in today's society, who does most of the mental work in the household, most of the emotional work. And I don't think that back in the days it was any different. I actually think it was probably worse, which is kind of like interesting how when the split happened between like design thinking versus execution, that women weren't the top leaders. And this also has to do with ownership, which was basically not allowed for women to have. What I mean by ownership is like property, businesses, contracts, patents. Thank you. So all of these things, of course, went to men. So even if you were like strategically thinking back in the days, you could not patent it, or you could not get ownership of it.
Of your ideas.
Yeah.
And I think it's also important to note that just it's not that women weren't strategic or weren't thinking rationally or had the ability to work commercially. It's that they were discouraged, or they were not encouraged to go in that direction. So also like in the 19th and 20th century, women were expected to work in things like textiles, ceramics, bookbinding, and pattern making. And these were labeled as applied arts, which are valued less in our society. And just from like a financial perspective and what you are compensated for doing that. And then men were encouraged to work in architecture, industrial design, and graphic design. And these fields gained institutional recognition and higher pay. There is a gap as well. Like even today, there are more women doing things like illustration, typography, and textile design. And then men are leading in branding, strategy, and digital services. So you see that this encouragement that happened back in the day, you see the result of that today, which is like an industry that is, when you look at, and we're going to go into this in another episode, and you look at like the statistics on how many women study design.
That's actually pretty interesting. We're
Yeah,
not going
but
to spoiler it today, but
yeah, but then it's men that you see the most of in like these leading positions, or in the strategic positions, or in the positions where you get the most pay. And it's just a result of like historically women being encouraged to go in the more execution direction, and men to go into the strategic direction. And then when you're in this execution part of the industry, we all know the people executing are the ones making the least amount of money, and the people at the top who are doing the strategic thinking, the direction, are the ones making more money. To go back to the fact that women are doing this work for free, or have been doing the work for free historically, So not only were women historically just doing these kinds of creative tasks as part of their domestic labor, but there were also women who worked at their husbands' agencies and did the work for free and weren't credited. Early female designers often worked without credit in studios in general, not only if it was their husband, but it could have been their brother or somebody in their family.
It's so telling for the zeitgeist back then, because also remember, I think everyone knows the example of a lot of male authors, quotation marks, were actually women. And I think the same thing also happened in design, because you couldn't have ownership, you couldn't have anything. So you needed a male counterpart to do all those things for you. So even if you were the brain in the back, you could like not prove it because it all belonged to a man.
Exactly, because for a long time, women weren't even allowed to work officially. So what happened was a lot of women were working unofficially, not being paid. And then not only were they not being paid, but they also weren't given credit. And that credit has led to the big names in every single industry being men. And the one you brought up about, was it the authors you just brought up? Yeah. I saw this TikTok and I thought it was so funny. Apparently, it was TikTok, so take it with a grain of salt, but I'm just going to choose to believe it. Apparently, a lot of authors back in the day, their wives would die before them and they would stop writing. And their excuse was they're just so distraught about the death of their wife that they can't write anymore. But we know now, like, okay, it was probably because she was writing for him and he couldn't write once she died. So I thought that was a funny little anecdote.
I mean, one more recent thing, actually, like one more recent example, actually, is J.K. Rowling. I mean, not to get into her character, like apart from everything that goes into that topic, she also published with an acronym.
Yeah.
To make it seem like she is a man, because that's usually also a more selling.
A book will sell better, yeah.
Exactly. Like just like some little things that are still here, like you can find them basically everywhere.
Yeah, and another thing I wanted to touch upon on the like the craft part of things and how women just did these things as part of domestic labor. That probably, like, I don't have any factual evidence for this, but it's just my opinion. I feel like that's probably part of the reason why a lot of these creative things are seen as hobbies. It's like something you do because you have to do it as part of, like, I don't know, domestic whatever, like making invitations for a party, you know? You do it because you want to have something nice, like, for people to look at. It's not like something you need to do and everything, and that's just automatically devalued. And then a lot of these creative things automatically become also become devalued because everyone thinks it's just a hobby.
Yeah, I think that it's already pretty telling that most of the TikToks or most of the media you see around crafting is usually like centered towards women.
Yeah. And it's always this hobby you're doing.
Yeah.
But the thing is that a lot of the things you're doing when you create something everything. It requires skill. It requires expertise. And those things should be compensated, of course. And if it's not your hobby, which it isn't for every single person who does it professionally, you need to be paid for that work, regardless if it's like execution or strategy. It's all worth something.
Yeah, I guess that also ties into, in general, women fields being devalued.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's another big topic. I'm not sure if we want to touch upon that one, but it's also important to note that I think, I'm not 100% sure about the statistics. I don't have them here. But
don't you think it has been devalued in our industry, though, because women dominate in terms of design?
I think it has been devalued. The execution of it all has been devalued.
Yeah, because women do it.
Yeah,
mostly.
Exactly. But I don't think that the design thinking has been devalued.
No. And that's also to go back to the history, because that's something we mentioned at the beginning of the episode, or like the context of this episode is that the design thinking has always been masculinized. That's always been the man's path, whereas the execution was the woman's path. So it's already, like, from the beginning of our industry, they already made that distinction between, okay, this is what the women are doing and everything that women do are not worth a lot. And then this is what the men are doing and everything that men do is worth a lot. So it's interesting to see that still applies to the industry today.
Yeah. Okay, let's put a bookmark here because we're gonna go into the statistics and into the creative industry as it is today in another episode. I would like to jump back in history now, back to Bauhaus. That will give us a bit more context on why women are underrepresented in our industry.
Yeah, so the Bauhaus movement is an interesting one because women made up a large part of the student body. But they were pushed again into kind of the female, it's considered feminized work. Things like weaving and ceramics. Meanwhile, the men were leading workshops, and those workshops, like when we look back on the Bauhaus movement, all of the things that defined the visual language of modernism, that was all based on the things that the men were doing during that time, even though women made up a huge part of that movement. But they're rarely talked about and rarely, they're rarely recognized. So there's very little, like whenever we talk about Bauhaus, we're always talking about the men. I mean, this is true of probably every single movement out there. Not to like say something that isn't true, but let's be for real. And then, okay, so going into the modernist movement, this is also just typical of every single industry, everything that happens in our world, that a lot of the contributions of women were either omitted entirely or they were just attributed to male collaborators. So basically, if a project was done by men and women would just be discluded from the crediting of it. So it would just have the men's names there.
Yeah, I think it's like also so unfair to think about that because there's just so much work from women, so much history of work from women that is gone missing. Like that we will never know. And like looking back into the history of things, like you really have to research if you want to find women. And there are actually like some there are actually some women who are now in like in design history books or whatever, but it's always just like maybe I would say a handful, and they were probably like really looking for them, which is such a sad testament.
Yeah, and it's not representative of what really happened. And I mean, not to go too much into that, but the people writing these books, at least back then, were also men. So of course they only highlighted other men. Yeah. It's like there's a study on this that men they're more likely to read a book if it's written by another man. It's not true for women. Women will read any book, like regardless of gender. To go back to the history books and why that's important. So graphic design history books written in the 60s, 70s, and 80s would omit women entirely, even though women were central to advertising, production, layout work, and typesetting. Why is this important? It's because when we go to school and we learn about design, what do we see in the books? We see men. Why does that affect us as women? Because we don't see ourselves as somebody in leadership positions. Not actively, but it happens subconsciously. So if you're only ever seeing men having made a big impact in our industry, then you just assume, okay, that's like a man thing.
I think that you can spread that logic across every field. If you look at women or male-dominated fields, why are they women or male-dominated? It has a lot to do with the impression of the job, with what you just said, the representation in the job, and how many people are willing to kind of break the ceiling, to not care if it's like a women or male-dominated field. Like, it's also amazingly difficult to break into fields that are, for example, men-dominated. Let's say construction work. There's hardly any women there. I don't think it's because of the lack of interest in that field. It's more because of the entry barrier that you have. Like you're facing so many extra obstacles if you want to break into industries like that. So there's also something that's important to remember beyond just like, I'm not represented. That means, okay, I'm not even thinking of like being that. And on top of that, if you actually want to be that, you have way more obstacles in your way than maybe another demographic.
So going back to representation, the reason why representation is so important is because in order to dismantle these structures, you need to have, first of all, the structure needs to be there for women to have an easy entryway, like you mentioned with the construction example. Is the entry into graphic design easy for women? Yes. is the entry into leadership easy? No.
Yeah, actually, when we go into the creative industry, it's actually quite interesting to see that even though the entry might be easy, there's still not a lot of women doing design work.
Exactly. So the leadership, like one way to look at it is we don't have representation historically in the books. Like obviously there is representation there. They just weren't highlighted. But then the other problem is that the whole structure of our industry isn't made for us. And it isn't made, yes, it's easy for us to enter that industry, but it's not easy for us to excel and it's not easy for us to lead the industry. And that's what we're going to go into in the second episode of this series. Thank you for listening to this episode of Never Went to Business School. Don't forget to follow us here on Spotify. And if you enjoy our content, check out our YouTube channel for more educational videos and subscribe to our newsletter on Substack.